Socrates' wife, Xanthippe. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. So when she's described, she's framed as almost just like this very hot-tempered prude, is that what you'd call it? And kind of Socrates
Prudish, yeah.
and Socrates is kind of a bit distant from her and kind of more focused on philosophy. But when I was thinking about the relationship, I was thinking that it sounds almost like a abusive relationship. It sounds almost like there's, like the way she's acting, it sounds like she is verbally and physically abusing Socrates, and he may have some kind of personality disorder, right? She's not quite stable, just from the description.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I can see that, right? And but I think there's alternative ways of interpreting it, right? So it's possible, right? With something like that, I guess, writing biography and telling a story, ancient history, I think there's multiple possible interpretations. There's one that's maybe more sort of favorable to her or to Socrates, and then there's ones that are maybe a little bit more cynical or maybe like more concerned about like what we're reading. And then we also need to cut some slack or make some allowances for cultural differences, right? So in the ancient Mediterranean world, I think it's fair to say that people expressed emotion differently. And, people typically expressed emotion in a much more physical form. So some of the behavior in general seems a little bit shocking to us. So we will often hear even about adult Mediterranean men tearing their hair out, beating their chests, beating their face with their fists, in grief over something or rage. So, we don't in modern day America, Britain, or Canada kind of express our emotions in that way, but people in other cultures do, right? So there's more of kind of physical expressiveness. So it's not, with that in mind, we're told things like she tore the shirt off his back, she threw a bucket of water over him, she trampled a cake that he'd been given as a gift, which sounds kind of extreme from our point of view. I don't think it would actually have seemed as extreme in classical Athenian culture. I could be wrong about that, but the impression I get is that kind of really expressive physical emotional behavior was not as unusual in those times as it would be today. So can we view it as a personality disorder or some kind of mental health problem? It's very difficult to make a judgment about that, in my view, when we're dealing with cultural differences in emotion. Like, if that's within the normal bounds of emotional expression, it might seem really weird to us or kind of extreme to us. I suppose the question would be, if someone's emotional reactions are much more extreme than other members of their culture, then we're more likely to think in terms of a mental health diagnosis. But what if that's within the normal bounds of how people in general express their emotion in that culture? Then I think it's harder to label it as a mental health problem. It's tricky. It's a notoriously difficult question. Cross-cultural psychopathology, basically, and especially when we're talking about different eras in history. But so I keep an open mind about it. I can kind of see it either way. Maybe Socrates' wife was crazy. Like maybe she was like, maybe she had mental health problems, or maybe she was a really horrible person, or maybe I can imagine also it just coming across differently in that culture. It might be that people looking at her just thought this is how a lot of people react, like in classical Athens in these situations. But it would seem weird to us. Now, in terms of his relationship with us, we don't have a lot of evidence, but by the way, she's believed to have been about 30 years younger than him. So she sounds like she was quite a lot younger than him, which actually wouldn't have been that unusual in ancient Greece and also like in Roman society as well. today we might think that's quite a big age gap, but no, it wouldn't seem so out of place then. Especially also, by the way, after many adult men had been killed in the Peloponnesian War, so there wouldn't be as many. There would be a lot of unmarried women and not as many men around. And there's also a story that Socrates had 2 wives. And again, some scholars believe that's plausible, and it could be a consequence of the Peloponnesian War, like that maybe it became the norm for men to take a second wife. So that somebody, would have to, in their culture, take responsibility, perhaps for women that had been widowed or that the husbands weren't available for, or so there's some cultural differences and complexities there. Socrates, in one of Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates says that he emphasizes that Xanthippe is a good wife and a good mother, and that he really values her, despite the fact that she has this hot temper. So it's hard because we don't know her, right? But at least in that little snippet, he comes across as seeming quite confident that she's somebody that he values as a wife and a mother to his children. Maybe even, I hesitate. I was about to say that it's somebody that he loves, but actually in classical Athens in that time, it's not that common for men to express love towards their wives. Most of the love poetry that we have, brace yourselves, gentle readers, like from classical Athens, most but not all of the love poetry is written by between men, rather than written by men to women. And so it was bisexuality of a sort was fairly normal. Like sexual mores were very different from our society. So Socrates quite possibly had a male lover of sorts, like in addition, and maybe 2 wives. Like, so there's a bit of a different family setup. So much for the nuclear family and all that, right? Yeah. Like, it wasn't necessarily as simple as that in ancient Athens. But yeah, she can come across as a bad mother. But actually, in that dialogue with Lamprocles, there Socrates really seems to be making the case that despite her bad temper, she's actually a fundamentally good and caring person. So he's kind of making out that we shouldn't be too quick to judge somebody by just the superficial behavior. So somebody might have quite a sharp tongue, but still you can imagine somebody who could be, could raise a voice, and be quite sharp. But when you view the behavior in general, they still come across as a very loving and caring person, right? Yeah. People are complex. Like, I think that's the picture I feel. So we have such little information to go on. It's a little bit tricky, but that's one way of interpreting what he says about her.
It was interesting because doesn't he kind of make the claim that he uses her to almost practice his tolerance, and he chose a wife that was particularly difficult to kind of rein in?
He compares it to training horses. But the funny thing, I don't think it mentions this in the dialogue, but that's what her name means. Xanthippe means a yellow horse. And he says, someone who's learning to train horses, again, a bit like this thing about choosing a sparring partner, which is a strange analogy for a wife, but like he said someone who's learning to train horses would pick like not easily domesticated horses, but ones that are, that are harder so that they can train and improve their skills. Yeah. Right? If you imagine there's different, you could grade horses on how difficult they are to train, and if you want to really improve your skills as a horse trainer, then you start working with progressively more difficult ones until you're the go-to guy for dealing with even the most difficult. And he says Xanthippe is challenging, but I guess it's like this thing as well of being able to choose, is this something that you're confident that you can deal with, or is it something that you would just feel overwhelmed by? And Socrates seems completely, I mean, Socrates probably is an exceptionally resilient individual. So he seems completely unfazed. And actually, funnily enough, you could say, if we say this is abuse, like tearing his shirt and throwing water over him, she doesn't actually do him any physical harm, right? So, and sometimes he seems to joke about that. Like he said, there's a joke where she threw water over him, and he said, "I told you that Xanthippe's thunder would be followed by rain." Right? So he's like, it's nothing to him. Like, it's not. This is a guy that survived the plague and 3 major battles in the Peloponnesian War. Also, we should remember. Like, he's seen people being slaughtered around him. His wife throwing a bucket of water over his head is like super trivial.
Yeah.
Like in Socrates' terms.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by that relationship because there's so many questions and it's open to interpretation.